The wedding guests did not cheer. They watched, the way crowds watch a man walk to the gallows, with that particular London silence that is somehow louder than applause. 300 aristocrats in their finest silk and pretension, and not one of them could find the decency to look away. Lady Evelyn Ashford stood at the altar of St. Margaret's with her spine straight and her jaw locked, because the Ashford women had always known how to bleed without flinching. Beside her, in his wheelchair, Duke Cedric Blackthorne stared forward with the absolute stillness of a man who had long since stopped caring what rooms thought of him. I was not what she expected. That was the first thing that cracked her certainty. And the crack, though hairline thin that morning, would eventually split her entire world open. Stay with this story, because everything you think you know about monsters is about to become embarrassingly wrong. No, the carriage smelled like old money and fresh humiliation. Evelyn sat with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes fixed on the window as London dissolved into the gray afternoon outside, the terraced houses giving way to broader streets, then to the walled estates of the outer districts, and finally to the long tree-lined road that led to Blackthorne Manor, like a throat leading somewhere dark. She had not spoken since they left the church. Neither had he. Cedric Blackthorne sat across from her in the modified carriage, wider than standard, the floor reinforced to accommodate the wheelchair that had been folded and stored beside the driver. And he read. An actual book, not even pretending to look at her. Some government document bound in blue cloth that he turned pages of with the same disinterested efficiency with which other men breathed. Evelyn studied him the way you study a locked box you intend to eventually open. He was older, 51 to her 23, a gap that London's gossip columns had already transformed into something obscene, but not ancient the way she'd prepared herself for. The gray at his temples was severe, yes. The lines carved into his face were deep in the way that only sustained pain carves lines, not merely time. His hands, the one visible holding the document, were large and unscarred, which struck her as wrong for a war veteran, and she filed that wrongness away without knowing yet what cabinet to put it in. I was not grotesque. She had been ready for grotesque. Instead, he was simply contained, as if everything about the man had been compressed inward over years until what remained on the surface was purely functional. A face for looking out from, a body for occupying space. Nothing wasted on expression. You're staring, he said, without looking up. I'm assessing. Is there a difference? Staring implies I haven't decided anything yet. She turned back to the window. I've decided. He turned a page. And what have you decided, Lady Evelyn? That you're going to be a very manageable problem. The silence that followed was not the silence of a man offended. It was the silence of a man who found something mildly interesting in the way a naturalist finds an unusual insect mildly interesting, worth a second look, nothing more. Manageable, he repeated with an inflection that turned the word over like a coin, examining both sides. Don't worry, she said. I'm very good at managing. Your family's finances suggest otherwise. The words landed with the precision of a surgeon's cut, not savage, not cruel, simply accurate in the way that accurate things are sometimes the most brutal of all. Evelyn felt the flush rise in her chest and disciplined it down with the practiced ease of a woman who had spent 3 years pretending her family wasn't drowning. She didn't respond. Not because she had no response. She had several, each one sharper than the last. But because something instinctive warned her, this man was waiting for her to be reactive. She recognized the trap because she'd set the same one herself, in drawing rooms and at dinner tables, when she wanted someone to expose the architecture of their anger. She would not expose hers, not yet. The East Wing is yours, Cedric said, closing the document and setting it aside. Servants, accounts for household expenses, full social calendar management. I ask for discretion regarding my visitors, punctuality at the dinners I require you to attend, and the appearance of a functioning marriage at public events. He regarded her with those flat, observant eyes. In exchange, your family's debts will be cleared within 30 days. Your brother's commission will be reinstated, and your mother will receive a quarterly allowance for the rest of her natural life. Evelyn looked at him. You've reduced our marriage to a service contract, she said. I've reduced it to what it is. Most men at least pretend otherwise on the wedding day. I'm not most men. No, she thought, looking at him, at the economy of his posture, the absence of any performance in his face, the way he seemed to take up exactly as much space as he needed, and no more. No, you certainly are not. Fine, she said, but I want it in writing. For the first time, something moved in his expression. Not a smile. Something that might become a smile if it ever decided to commit. You'll have it before morning. The carriage turned through the iron gates of Blackthorn Manor, and Evelyn got her first real look at the place that would now, for better or catastrophically worse, be her life. It was vast. That was the first word. Vast in the way that certain old English estates are vast, not with the cheerful expansiveness of new money, but with the dense, accumulated weight of centuries. The stone was dark. The windows were tall and narrow and lit from within by firelight that made the glass look amber from outside, like preserved things in jars. The grounds were immaculate in a severe, unornamented way. Nothing frivolous, no decorative gardens, just precision. Topiary clipped to pure geometry, gravel raked to parallel lines. She thought, this is a house that was designed by someone who didn't trust beauty. Then she corrected herself. This is a house that was designed by someone who didn't trust anything at all. The servants lined the entrance drive in the traditional formation, 12 of them, in black and charcoal gray livery, standing with the rigid discipline of soldiers rather than the practiced warmth of household staff. They did not smile. They watched Cedric's carriage arrive the way sentinels watch a perimeter. They were afraid of him. Not the performative fear of servants who've been scolded. Not the resentful fear of people trapped in bad employment. This was something older and quieter. The fear of people who have seen enough of a man to understand that their understanding of him is probably incomplete, and that the incomplete parts are likely the important ones. Evelyn stepped down from the carriage and walked the line of their silence and felt something she hadn't expected to feel on her wedding day. The sharp, clarifying awareness that she was very far from any help. The housekeeper, a tall woman of 60, iron-haired, with the face of someone who has been keeping her opinions to herself for so long that the effort had become structural, stepped forward and introduced herself as Mrs. Hartwell. "Your rooms are prepared, my lady, if you'll follow me." Evelyn followed, and as she crossed the threshold of Blackthorn Manor, for the first time as its mistress, its nominal, contractual, transactional mistress, she made herself a promise in the privacy of her own skull, where no document could reach it. "I will learn everything about this place, everything about this man, and then I will use it." The East Wing was not a consolation prize. She had expected something tolerated, decent enough to not embarrass him, insufficient enough to remind her of her position. What she found instead were rooms that had been recently and expensively refurbished, with the specific taste of someone who had read a detailed account of her preferences and applied them literally. The sitting room bookshelves held titles she recognized as her own choices, not the fashionable reads of the season, but the specific idiosyncratic things she'd been seen purchasing or borrowing over the past 2 years. The writing desk faced the window at the angle she always positioned her own writing furniture. The bedroom fireplace was of a type that ran hotter than standard, which she preferred, and had since childhood. He had researched her. She stood in the center of the bedroom and felt the first genuine cold she'd experienced all day. Not the cold of the November air or the cold of the carriage, but the cold of being known by someone you don't know at all. Mrs. Hartwell appeared in the doorway. "Is everything satisfactory, my lady?" "When were these rooms prepared?" Evelyn asked. "The refurbishment began in August, my lady." August. 3 months before the engagement was even publicly announced. Before Evelyn herself had been formally informed of the arrangement her father was negotiating. He had been selecting her furniture while she was still under the assumption that her life was going to proceed along ordinary lines. "The Duke is thorough," Evelyn said carefully. "The Duke is always thorough, my lady." Something in Mrs. Hartwell's voice made the word thorough sound like a warning. After the housekeeper withdrew, Evelyn sat at the research desk in front of the preferred window facing the correctly angled garden and stared at the letter that had been left for her. The written contract he had promised, drafted by his solicitors, formal and exhaustive and precisely what he had described in the carriage. Every clause of their arrangement, documented and signed on his side with a handwriting that was small and angular and gave nothing away. A space for her signature at the bottom. She read it 3 times, found no hidden clauses, no ambiguities carefully constructed to work against her later. It was, as far as she could determine, entirely what he had said it was. That bothered her more than if it had been a trap. She signed it, folded it, set it in the drawer, Then she sat in the firelight of her efficiently warm bedroom in the house of the man she had married for survival, and thought about how strange it was that survival so often looked, from the outside, like defeat. The first dinner was theater, not theater in the sense of performance, though it was that too, but theater in the structural sense. Two figures across a table, a formal distance between them measured in silver candlesticks and good crystal, and the geometry of a room designed to make intimacy difficult. 12 courses they would not finish. Two footmen standing at the margins with the particular trained invisibility of household staff who have learned to hear without registering what they hear. Cedric ate with efficiency. No visible pleasure, no visible displeasure. He consumed food the way he apparently consumed everything, as a logistical necessity managed with minimum friction. Evelyn, who had been raised by a mother who believed dinner conversation was its own form of warfare, opened with, "I understand you know the Prime Minister personally. We've met." "That's not what I said." He looked at her over the rim of his glass. "No, it isn't. Do you make a habit of being deliberately uninformative, or is this a special performance for my benefit? Do you make a habit of asking questions to which you've already determined the answer?" She paused, set down her fork. "What makes you think I've already determined it?" The specific phrasing, "You said I understand, you know," not "I've heard" or "I was told." The first is something you say when you've verified a thing through multiple sources and are giving the subject an opportunity to confirm or deny what you already believe is true. It's a lawyer's construction. You're not a lawyer, but you're trained to think like one. Evelyn stared at him. "By whom?" she asked. "Your uncle. Lord Prescott has been using you as an informal intelligence analyst for his political correspondence since you were 17. He values your synthesis more than your discretion, which is why he doesn't realize how much of what he tells you you've repurposed for your own understanding." The room was very quiet. "You've had me investigated," she said. "I've had everyone who enters this house investigated. I'm not a visitor. I'm your wife." "That," he said, returning his attention to his plate, "makes the investigation more important, not less." Evelyn picked up her fork, stabbed a piece of pheasant with more force than was technically necessary, ate it, chewed, swallowed, let several seconds pass in which she assembled the available information about this man into a new configuration, the way you restack a hand of cards when the game changes. "You knew about my uncle before you agreed to the marriage," she said. "Yes, you knew what my family's actual situation was." Comprehensively. "So why—" She stopped. Reorganized. "What exactly do you want from this arrangement that a straightforward financial transaction with my father wouldn't have provided?" Cedric set down his silverware with a small, precise sound. He looked at her. Actually looked, the way he hadn't at dinner yet, with something that was almost attention instead of the monitoring he'd been doing since they sat down. "Your uncle is going to need to be in my house in the next 6 months," he said. "Voluntarily, without suspicion, at a social occasion that appears entirely natural." The cold was back, spreading upward from her sternum. "You married me to get access to my uncle. Among other considerations." "What other considerations?" "You're intelligent, adaptable, and motivated by consequences rather than ideology. That makes you reliable in ways that more principled people are not." He picked up his silverware again. "Also, the arrangement was beneficial to your family. That matters. You want me to feel that you've been generous. I want you to understand that I don't require your cooperation through force when your self-interest provides it more efficiently." Evelyn looked at this man, this cold, deliberate, architecturally precise man who had built their entire marriage like a tactical operation and was now explaining it to her at dinner with the same tone one used to discuss weather patterns, and felt something she had not anticipated feeling. Not fear. Not even anger, though that was present, running hot just below the surface. What she felt, underneath both of those things, was the specific and unsettling recognition of a mind that operated the way she wished hers operated, without sentiment, without the drag of needing to be liked, without the constant overhead cost of managing other people's perception of her. She hated him for it. She hated him the way you hate the version of yourself you couldn't become. "What did my uncle do to you?" she asked. Cedric said nothing. "I'm going to find out," she said. "You know that. I expect nothing less. And when I do—" "When you do," he said quietly, "be very careful what you decide to do with the information. Not every truth is a door you want to walk through." She found the first document 11 days later. She hadn't been searching for anything specific. That was what she told herself, and the lie was clean enough that she almost believed it through the first week. She was simply familiarizing herself with the household, learning the rhythms of the manor, which servants moved where and when, which rooms were used and which were functionally sealed, which hours the Duke spent in his study and which he spent in the East receiving room where the strange midnight visitors arrived. The visitors were the second thing she noticed, after the servants' fear. They came on irregular schedules, never the same night twice in a row, never a pattern she could predict. Men in plain clothes who arrived by the rear gate and left before dawn. Once, a woman in a gray traveling cloak who stayed for 40 minutes and left in a hired carriage with curtained windows. Once, two men who, she was certain, based on their bearing and the specific quality of their silence, were military officers traveling without uniform. She noted them all: dates, times, approximate descriptions, duration of visits. In a small notebook she kept behind a loose board in the East Wing sitting room that she'd discovered on her second day, and immediately identified as the kind of structural irregularity that old houses accumulated and new inhabitants never found. The notebook was filling. So, on the 11th day, when Cedric's study sat empty for the 3 hours he spent with his personal physician, a weekly appointment, another pattern she'd charted, Evelyn walked through the connecting corridor of the manor's upper floor with the unhurried confidence of a woman who lived here and opened the door. The study was what she'd expected: large, deliberately unimpressive, every surface functional, books that were actually read. You could tell from the wear on the spines, the occasional mark at the edges, on topics ranging from military history to parliamentary procedure to what appeared to be advanced hydraulic engineering. Maps on one wall, not decorative but analytical, with small markings in pencil at various points. A desk of dark wood, massive and unornamented, that took up more of the room than was strictly necessary, as if it had been built to the specific dimensions of someone who needed a lot of space to think. She went to the desk first. The surface drawers were empty of anything sensitive. She'd expected that. The man was not careless. She spent several minutes identifying the concealed compartment in the lower left panel, which was good work but not impenetrable to someone who had spent 3 years helping her uncle manage correspondence he didn't want traced, and found inside it a folded bundle of documents secured with a length of red ribbon. She untied it, unfolded the first document. It was a military dispatch from 12 years prior, a communiqué from the Field Command of the Northern Campaign to the War Office in London, citing intelligence failure at the Caravan Ridge engagement as the reason for the ambush of the Blackthorn Regiment. The language was formal and bureaucratic. The conclusion it reached was that the intelligence failure was an administrative error, a miscommunication in the chain of reporting. Someone had written in the margin, in that small, angular hand she now recognized, "This is a lie." The second document was a private letter. Its author was a name she recognized. Not immediately, but after a moment. Lord Harcastle, who was currently the Undersecretary for Foreign Affairs, and who had been, 12 years ago, a senior intelligence coordinator for the Northern Campaign. The letter was addressed to another name, to a name she knew very well because she had known the man her entire life, to Lord Prescott, her uncle. The letter described, in the careful, deniable language of men who understand that written words survive their intentions, a deliberate misdirection of field intelligence. A decision made by 3 individuals to allow the Blackthorn Regiment's position to be communicated to the opposing field command. Not accidentally, not through negligence, deliberately. In exchange, the letter made clear, for a guarantee of political advancement post-campaign that had, in the subsequent 12 years, been comprehensively delivered. Evelyn stood in the dim study of her husband's house and held a document that proved her uncle had conspired to have 300 men and their commanding officer ambushed and killed, that the ambush had half succeeded, that the men had died, that their commanding officer had survived with injuries that had put him in a wheelchair, which he had spent 12 years sitting in while he systematically gathered every piece of evidence he needed to destroy the people responsible. She heard the door behind her. "I was wondering," Cedric said from the threshold, "which day it would be." He was in the wheelchair, the physician's appointment apparently concluded early or she had miscounted the time, and he was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not anger, not even the cold monitoring she'd come to expect, but something tightly controlled that was much more dangerous than either of those things. 11 days, he continued. faster than most, and most weren't looking as systematically as you were. Evelyn did not put the documents down. She was aware that putting them down would look like either guilt or retreat, and she was neither guilty nor retreating. "Your uncle," she said. Her voice was steady. She was proud of how steady it was. "Yes. He's on this document. He's one of the three." "He is. And you married me." "I married you for several reasons, as I told you. You married me to get close enough to him to destroy him." She heard the words as she said them, and they were flat and factual and terrible. "Using me." "I married you," Cedric said, moving into the room with the soft, mechanically efficient progress of the wheelchair on the study's hardwood floor. "Knowing that you were capable of handling the truth of your own situation with more competence than sentiment. I was correct. You found those documents in 11 days. That is remarkable. Don't flatter me to manage me." "I'm not. It's an observation." "Everything with you is an observation." She set the documents on the desk, not because she was retreating, but because she needed her hands free, and she was suddenly very aware of how enclosed this room was. "You've been sitting in this house for 12 years building a case against 3 men while the whole of London pities you as a crippled relic. You let them mock you, let them dismiss you, while I worked," he said simply. "While you manipulated every person around you into a position that serves your objective. Including you." The word landed like the man himself operated, without apology, without amelioration, simply as a fact that had the bad manners to be true. Evelyn looked at him in that study with the maps on the walls, and the evidence on the desk, and 12 years of cold, controlled fury distributed through the room like load-bearing architecture, and she said, "You could have told me. Would you have helped me?" "I don't know." "Exactly." He was closer now. The desk between them, but still closer than he had positioned himself at any point in 11 days of cohabitation. "I needed you operational before you knew the stakes. I needed to understand how you functioned under ordinary conditions before I introduced the extraordinary ones. I am not one of your field operations. No, you're considerably more complicated. If this is you being disarming, I'm never disarming," he said. "I don't have the temperament for it." Evelyn's hands, she realized them with some irritation, were shaking slightly. Not from fear. She didn't think it was fear. It was something closer to the physical sensation of the ground shifting, of having the floor you've been standing on revealed to be suspended and looking down for the first time. "My uncle is going to be at the Harcastle dinner in 3 weeks," she said. "Yes. You need him in a room where you can control the variables." "Yes. And you need me to ensure he attends and is comfortable enough not to be watchful." "Yes." She picked up the documents, set them down again. Looked at Cedric Blackthorne, this patient, terrible, extensively damaged man who had constructed their marriage the way he constructed everything, as a function of long-term strategic necessity, and felt the decision crystallize in her before she had consciously made it. "I want to know everything," she said. "Everything you have. Every document, every correspondent, every piece of what you've built. Not a redacted version, not what you decide I need. Everything." "That's a significant request. I'm a significant person." Something moved through his expression again. That not quite smile, that flicker of something that might, in a less carefully armored man, have been called regard. "And if I refuse," he said, "then you can get my uncle into that dinner yourself." She moved toward the study door. "And you can explain to the entire network of midnight visitors I've been documenting for 11 days that your wife proved to be less cooperative than anticipated." She paused at the threshold, turned back. "I have names, Cedric, dates. A description of the woman in the gray cloak who I believe is Lady Armount of the Foreign Office Committee, though I haven't confirmed that yet. I have the beginning of your network. How long do you think it takes me to build the rest of it once I know what I'm actually looking at?" The study was completely silent. Cedric looked at her from across the room with an expression she could not fully read, and she had become, in 11 days, reasonably fluent in the language of his face. "Sit down," he said. "I prefer to stand." "Lady Evelyn." A pause. Something in the pause that she couldn't categorize. "Please sit down." She sat. He crossed to the desk, opened a drawer she hadn't found, a second concealed compartment, deeper, requiring a specific sequence of pressure points she wouldn't have found without knowing to look, and removed a bound folio, thick as a book, that he set on the desk between them. "The 3 names at the top," he said, "are Hardcastle, Prescott, and a third party you will not yet have identified. What I'm about to show you has taken 12 years to compile. Once you've seen it, you cannot unsee it, and there are people who will kill you for knowing it." He met her eyes. "This is the last moment I will ask if you're certain." The folio sat between them like a door. Evelyn looked at it, looked at him, thought about her mother's quarterly allowance, her brother's reinstated commission, the debt cleared and the contract signed, and the careful, meticulous trap that had been built around her with the specific, infuriating competence of a man who was right about almost everything. Thought about the word that kept returning to her from the margins of that military dispatch. "This is a lie." Thought about 300 men in a field 12 years ago, following orders into an ambush that certain men in comfortable London offices had sent them toward deliberately. She opened the folio. She had read 4 pages, 4 dense, precisely evidenced, catastrophically damning pages, when the study door opened without a knock. One of the midnight men. Younger than she'd estimated from her window, with a face that was professionally neutral, and eyes that moved immediately to Cedric with the specific, calibrated urgency of someone who has trained themselves to deliver bad news without theatrics. "There's been a development," the man said. "Lady Evelyn," Cedric said, with a quality in his voice she hadn't heard from him before. Something stripped of the usual careful modulation, something underneath the surface. "Leave the room." "I don't think—" "Now." His eyes were still on the messenger. "And go directly to your wing and lock the door. Mrs. Hartwell will come to you." Evelyn stood. The folio was in her hands. She looked at Cedric, at whatever had briefly become visible in his expression before the control reasserted itself, that glimpse of something old and damaged and genuinely afraid, and she understood that whatever had just walked through that door was not a development in the ordinary sense. She walked out of the study. Behind her, as the door closed, she heard the messenger say, "They know about the March documents, sir, all 3 of them, and they know she's seen them." The door closed. Evelyn stood in the corridor of Blackthorn Manor with a folio full of evidence that could destroy half the British government pressed against her chest, and the sudden, absolute understanding that she was no longer a piece being moved across the board. She was now, whether she had intended it or not, a player. And somewhere in this city, 3 very powerful and very frightened men had just been told her name. She didn't go to her wing. She went to the east sitting room, to the loose board, to the notebook. She opened to a fresh page, and she began to write. The notebook had 14 pages filled by the time Mrs. Hartwell knocked. Evelyn heard the knock, and did not stop writing. Her hand moved across the page with the compact, controlled urgency of someone who understood that memory was unreliable and paper was not, and that whatever was happening on the other side of that study door was the kind of event that would look different in 6 hours than it looked right now, and different again in 6 days, and the version that existed in this moment, raw, unprocessed, before anyone had a chance to frame it for her, was the version worth preserving. Names, dates, the precise wording of what the messenger had said before the door closed, the sequence of Cedric's physical responses, the stillness first, the quality of attention shifting, and then that fraction of a second where something human moved through the architecture of his control like a crack in load-bearing stone. They know she's seen them. She wrote that down and underlined it twice. Mrs. Hartwell knocked again. "Come in," Evelyn said, without looking up. The housekeeper entered with the specific energy of a woman executing instructions she hadn't chosen, carrying a tray with tea she hadn't been asked for, and setting it on the side table with the deliberate quiet of someone who has learned that noise has consequences in this house. "The Duke asks that you remain in the East Wing this evening, my lady." "The Duke can ask whatever he likes." A pause. "He was quite specific." "I'm sure he was." Evelyn finished the sentence she was writing, capped her pen, looked up at Mrs. Hartwell for the first time. The woman's face was doing something complicated. Not quite alarm, not quite the flat professional mask she wore in the corridors. Something between the two. "How long have you worked for him?" 14 years, my lady." "Were you here before the injury?" The slightest hesitation. "I came to the manor 2 years after." "So you never knew the version of him that could walk?" Mrs. Hartwell's expression went very still. "I don't think that's a useful distinction, my lady." "I don't think you believe that." Evelyn stood, moved to the window. Outside, the rear grounds were dark, the paths lit only by the service lanterns at the gate. Empty, as far as she could see. "Has this happened before?" Men arriving with urgent information, the manor going on to whatever footing it's currently on? I couldn't say, my lady. Couldn't or won't. The housekeeper looked at her with something that was almost briefly respect. Won't, my lady. Evelyn nodded. That was honest, at least. Tell the Duke I'll remain in the East Wing. She picked up the notebook. And tell him I want to speak with him before he does anything with the information that messenger brought. Tonight, if possible. I'll convey the message, my lady. Mrs. Hartwell. The woman paused at the door. The people who know I've seen those documents, are they the kind of people who would come here? The silence lasted exactly long enough to be an answer. Drink your tea, my lady, Mrs. Hartwell said, and closed the door. Cedric came to the East Wing at 11:30. She heard the particular sound of his wheelchair on the upper corridor's hardwood. She'd learned the sound in the first week, the way you learn the specific creaks of a house you're trying to navigate in the dark. And she was standing when the door opened, not sitting, because she'd decided 2 hours ago that she was not going to receive this conversation from a seated position. He looked at her for a moment without speaking. He looked, she thought, like a man who had been having a very direct argument with himself and had not yet fully resolved it. Sit down, he said. No. Something moved in his jaw. Not quite tension. He was past the point where tension showed on him that plainly. Something more internal. I'm not here to give you instructions. Then why did you say sit down? Habit. He moved into the room, stopping near the writing desk, and she noticed because she noticed everything now, had been noticing everything since that study door closed on the messenger's voice, that he had positioned himself with his back to the wall and his line of sight to the door clear. An operational habit, automatic as breathing. Tell me what happened, she said. Lord Harcastle's private secretary made contact with an intermediary connected to your uncle's household 2 hours ago. The communication referenced documents from March of last year, the March documents the messenger mentioned. Those documents don't exist in the folio you were reading. They're the next layer, the layer that names the third party. And they know I've seen the first layer. Yes. How? Someone in this house, he said, has been providing information to Harcastle's network for approximately 4 months. The room was very quiet. You have an informant on your own staff, Evelyn said. Had. He's been removed from the property. She looked at him. Removed. He's alive, Cedric said, with an inflection that made the word alive sound like a specific, deliberate choice rather than a default outcome. He's in a location where he can't communicate with anyone until I determine what he's given them and when. Evelyn processed this. The systematic quality of it, the absence of visible emotion. You already knew who it was. I identified the most probable candidate 3 weeks ago. I needed him operational long enough to determine the full scope of what had been communicated. You let him keep feeding information to Harcastle. Controlled information, yes. She exhaled slowly. So when the messenger said they know she's seen them, they know you've seen the first layer of documents. They don't know the extent of what I've shared with you, because until this evening I hadn't shared anything beyond that. What they're calculating now is the threat level you represent. He looked at her steadily. They'll conclude you're either an asset I'm weaponizing against them or a liability I've accidentally created. And which of those is worse for me? The second. Evelyn turned to the window. The grounds were still empty, but the stillness felt different now. Not the clean, cold stillness of an English November night, but the compressed stillness of a space where someone is being careful not to be detected. She was aware of her own breathing, the specific weight of the folio she'd brought up from the study, sitting on the writing desk behind her. What do they do? She said. To liabilities? Cedric didn't answer immediately. That was its own answer. She turned back to face him. I need you to be direct with me. I am always direct with you. Then directly. Am I in danger? You have been in some degree of danger, he said, since the moment your family's solicitor made contact with mine. You're the wife of a man who has spent 12 years building a case against 3 of the most protected individuals in British public life. The danger was always a feature of the arrangement. I believed it was manageable. A pause. I still believe that. But the timeline has compressed. He moved to the desk, stopped. There was something in the way he was holding himself. Too still, the specific stillness of a man keeping something physical from showing. that she was learning to read as the external sign of whatever Cedric Blackthorne used instead of ordinary emotional processing. I had planned for the confrontation to occur on my terms, at a moment of my choosing, with the full weight of the compiled evidence already in the hands of 3 individuals who cannot be politically pressured or legally threatened. The messenger's news means Hardcastle has moved earlier than anticipated. He's frightened. Frightened men make accelerated decisions. Frightened men make mistakes, Evelyn said. Cedric looked at her. Yes. So his moving early is also an opportunity. Something shifted in his expression. The not quite smile again, but sharper than she'd seen it. More unguarded. Most people, when told they may be in danger, do not immediately pivot to strategic opportunity. Most people, she said, haven't spent 3 years managing a family's quiet collapse from the inside while maintaining the social performance that nothing is wrong. I know how to function under pressure. I'd appreciate it if you'd stop being surprised by that. He was quiet for a moment. The Hardcastle dinner, he said. I need to accelerate it. 2 weeks instead of 3. And I need your uncle there, comfortable, unsuspecting, and positioned for a private conversation with me that he believes he's orchestrating. You want him to think he's walking into a social call. I want him to think he's walking into an opportunity to assess me. Prescott has been trying to determine the true extent of my recovery for 2 years. I'll give him an invitation that appears to offer that. He won't be able to refuse. Evelyn thought about her uncle. His broad, careful face, his politician's laugh, the specific quality of warmth he deployed with family that had always felt in retrospect like a studied performance. She thought about a letter 12 years old, about 300 men in a field, about the word deliberately and what it meant when applied to other people's deaths. What do you need me to write? She said. Cedric crossed to the chair beside the writing desk and sat. From the pocket of his jacket, he removed a folded sheet, which he set on the desk without opening it. The structure is there, he said. The language needs to be yours. He'll recognize your voice. He's trained to identify inauthenticity in correspondence, and he knows your patterns well enough to detect a draft you haven't substantially rewritten. She sat at the desk, unfolded the sheet. Read it. It was good, structurally persuasive, hitting the specific notes of familial warmth and subtle flattery that her uncle responded to. But Cedric was right. It wasn't her. The rhythm was too even, too considered. Her actual letters to Prescott had a quality of interrupted thought, of ideas that started in one direction and veered, because that was how she wrote when she was writing to someone she genuinely knew. She picked up her pen. Cedric stayed in the chair beside her. He didn't watch her write. He looked at the window, at the same dark grounds she'd been watching, his hands resting in his lap with that particular stillness that she understood now was not passivity, but controlled readiness, like a held breath. She wrote, crossed out, rewrote. The scratch of the pen was the only sound. At some point, she didn't mark exactly when, she became aware of his nearness not as surveillance but as something else, something that didn't have a clean category. The warmth of another person in a room at 11:30 at night while you're doing something that frightens you, that is not comfort exactly, because comfort implied softness, and there was nothing soft about either of them, but was something structural, load-bearing in its way. She finished the letter, blotted it, set down the pen. That's as close to my voice as I can get while saying things I'd never naturally say, she said. He leaned forward and read it. She watched his eyes move across the lines, efficient, absorbing, and tried to read his face and got almost nothing, which was itself information. It's good, he said. Don't sound surprised. I'm not surprised. He folded the letter and set it aside. I told you. Adaptable. Is that the highest compliment you give people? Adaptable? It's the most reliable one. She turned in the chair to face him directly. They were closer than they'd been at any point in the 11 days of this marriage. Closer than the carriage, closer than the dinner table, closer than the study. And she was aware of it with a physical specificity that was inconvenient and irrelevant, and she noted it and set it aside the way she set aside everything that wasn't immediately operational. When this is over, she said, when the dinner happens, and the confrontation happens, and whatever you've been building for 12 years either lands or doesn't, what comes after that? He looked at her. I haven't thought past it, he said. That's not true. No, he agreed after a moment. It isn't. He looked at his hands briefly, the only gesture she'd seen him make that seemed unguarded. I've been operating toward a single objective for a very long time. The architecture of my life has been organized around it. When it resolves, he stopped. You don't know who you are without it, Evelyn said. The silence confirmed it more cleanly than any answer could have. She understood that. Understood it in the way you understand something that lives in you too. The specific vertigo of having built your entire functional identity on the scaffolding of a problem, and the terrifying blankness that waits on the other side of its solution. Cedric, she said. He looked at her with that focused, stripped quality. The face beneath the face, briefly. The third name, she said. The one in the March documents. The one I haven't seen yet. Yes. Is it someone I know? A long pause. Is it someone I know well? She pressed. His jaw tightened, fractionally. Yes. The cold moved through her slowly this time. Not the sharp cold of the study, but something that settled into her bones like weather. She thought about the people in her life, the architecture of her connections, the faces at dinners and in drawing rooms and at the family table over 23 years. Tell me, she said. Not tonight. Cedric, not tonight. He said it with a weight that was not a command. It was something else, something that cost him more than commands cost him, which was not much. There is a sequence to how this information can be safely known, and I have already accelerated it further than is advisable in the past 3 hours. Give me until morning. She wanted to push. Every functional instinct she had said, push, extract the information now, while his guard was as low as she'd ever seen it, while the night and the proximity and whatever was happening between the architecture of the two of them in this room had the environment working in her favor. She didn't push, not because she was being managed, because she looked at his face, at the controlled exhaustion in it, the 12-year weight of it, the fraction of something that was almost trust in the way he was sitting with her in this room at this hour. And she made a different calculation. Morning, she said. He stood, moved toward the door. There are 2 men on the grounds tonight, he said, without turning back. Not mine. They arrived within the last hour. They'll be watching the house until dawn and then they'll leave and report back, because their instructions will be observation only at this stage. He paused. Don't go to any windows. How do you know what their instructions are? Because I know who sent them, and I know how he thinks. And frightened men make accelerated decisions, but they don't make suicidal ones. Not yet. He opened the door. Cedric. He stopped. She found when she spoke that she was looking at the desk rather than at him, which was its own kind of information about her own internal architecture, which she would analyze later. In the morning, whatever the third name is, I want to hear it from you, not find it. Don't let me walk into it the way I walked into my uncle's name. A pause so brief it was almost not there. You have my word, he said. The door closed. Evelyn sat at the writing desk in the amber firelight and did not go to the window and thought about a promise made by a man who had, 11 days into their marriage, given her no particular reason to trust him and several compelling ones to respect him, and she decided those were not the same thing and that the difference between them was going to matter. She opened the notebook. She wrote third name, someone I know well. He wouldn't tell me tonight. He was protecting me from it, or protecting himself from saying it. Possibly both. She underlined the last 2 words. Then she wrote, on the line below, 2 men on the grounds, watching, not yet dangerous. The word yet is doing a great deal of work in that sentence. She capped the pen, looked at the fire, let herself, just for a moment in the privacy of her own skull, acknowledge that the ground had shifted again tonight. Not violently, not all at once, but in the slow tectonic way that permanent shifts move, and that the woman who had climbed into a carriage 11 days ago with a plan to manage an old broken man from the inside was not precisely the woman sitting at this desk. She was someone who had looked at the evidence of enormous patient suffering and had not looked away. She was someone who had written a letter to her uncle to help her husband destroy him. She was someone who had, at 11:30 at night in a firelit room, chosen to believe a promise from a man whose primary skill was the construction of systems in which trust was strategically unnecessary. She didn't know yet what to do with any of that. She knew it wasn't nothing. In the morning, she told herself. In the morning he'll tell me the third name and the picture will be complete and I'll know what I'm actually inside. She went to bed. She did not sleep. And at 3 in the morning, when the house was completely silent and the men on the grounds had presumably settled into their watching, she heard a sound from the direction of Cedric's study that she was almost certain, was a man's voice, muffled through 2 closed doors and 30 feet of corridor, saying a name. Her name. Not Cedric's voice, someone else's. She was out of bed before she'd decided to move. She moved through the dark corridor in her bare feet because shoes made sound, and sound was a variable she couldn't afford. And the cold of the floorboards against her soles was the kind of sensation that kept the mind from spiraling into the wrong register, kept it operational, kept it present, kept it in the body, instead of 3 steps ahead of itself where panic lived. 30 feet of corridor, 2 closed doors between her and whatever was happening in that study. The voice had stopped. That was worse than if it had continued. She reached the first door, the one connecting the east wing to the main corridor, and pressed her ear against it and heard nothing, which meant either the conversation had ended or it had moved deeper into the study, behind the second door, which was thicker, original to the house, designed in an era when men who kept secrets understood that architecture was the first line of privacy. She turned the handle with both hands, slowly, the way she'd learned to open doors in a house where every servant was a potential informant and every creak was a potential exposure, and eased it open 2 inches. The main corridor was dim. One wall sconce still lit at the far end, casting the kind of light that showed you shapes without details. What it showed her was the study door, closed, with the thin line of amber underneath it that meant the desk lamp was on inside, and 2 sets of shadows moving across that amber line. 2 people. Moving. Not the stillness of a private meeting, the specific weight-shifting movement of a confrontation. She was at the study door before she'd made a conscious decision to cross the corridor, and what stopped her from opening it was not caution, but the fragment of voice that reached her through the wood, a voice she recognized instantly, with a recognition that landed in her chest like something physical. Her father, Edward Ashford. Her father's voice, older and rougher than she remembered from 6 months ago, but unmistakable in the way that certain sounds are unmistakable, wired into you before you have language for them, before you have the critical distance to evaluate them. Told you what the arrangement was. You've moved her into this. You've put her directly in front of them and called it strategy. Lower your voice. Cedric. Flat. The voice he used when he was containing something. I will not lower my voice in the house of a man who has used my daughter as a... Edward. A pause. Ice in it. You came to this house at 3 a.m. through the rear gate using a key I gave you 4 months ago. Consider what that tells me about your current state of judgment before you continue. Silence. Evelyn stood with her forehead almost touching the study door and felt the floor shift in that slow tectonic way again, except this time it wasn't shifting towards something. It was dropping away entirely. 4 months ago. Her father had a key to the rear gate of Blackthorn Manor 4 months ago. Before the engagement. Before the formal arrangement. Before any of it had been presented to her as the unavoidable solution to the family's financial situation, the logical conclusion of her father's negotiations, the marriage that had been decided in rooms she wasn't in, the marriage that had been decided in this room. She pushed the door open. Both men turned. Her father, standing near the fireplace, older than 6 months should have made him, in a traveling coat that told her he'd come from somewhere with more distance than across London, went pale in a way that started at the hairline and moved downward. Cedric, at the desk, went absolutely still, which was its own kind of answer. Evelyn, her father said. She didn't look at him. She looked at Cedric. How long has he been involved? This isn't the time. How long? Cedric held her gaze. There was something in his face she hadn't seen before. Not guilt, because she doubted guilt was in his operational vocabulary, but the specific quality of a man facing a consequence he had calculated and accepted and is now experiencing in the actual rather than the theoretical. Your father came to me 14 months ago, he said. The number arrived without drama and destroyed everything quietly, the way structural failures often happen, not with the noise of something breaking, but with the silent redistribution of weight that comes before. 14 months, she said. He had information about Hardcastle's network that I needed, information that could only be obtained from within Prescott's household. He had access, I didn't. She looked at her father then. She looked at him the way you look at a landscape you thought you knew after someone points out that the horizon you've been navigating by is painted on a wall. You went to him, she said. Ellen, listen to me. You went to him, before any of this, before the arrangement, before the debts became something the family couldn't manage, before... She stopped, recalculated. The debts. Were the debts real? Her father said nothing. Were the debts real, father? They were real. His voice had the quality of a man choosing which true things to say and in what order. We were in genuine difficulty. The financial situation was not manufactured, but the timeline of it, the urgency. There were things that were allowed to progress faster than they might have in order to make the arrangement to make me necessary, Evelyn said. The fire in the grate made the only sound in the room. She understood it then, the full architecture of it, spread out in front of her the way the maps on Cedric's wall spread territories out. Her father had gone to the Duke with intelligence and come away with a plan, and the plan had included her from the beginning, not as a casualty of the family's circumstances, but as a specific, selected instrument. The debts had been real, but had been allowed to become catastrophic. The options had been real, but had been allowed to narrow. And at the end of that narrowing, there she was, intelligent, adaptable, motivated by consequences, with direct access to the one man in London whose cooperation Cedric needed and couldn't compel. Manageable, Cedric had called her in the carriage. Not a consolation, a specification. She turned back to Cedric. You told me you married me for several reasons. Yes. Was any of them not tactical? The pause lasted 3 seconds. She counted them. At the time of the arrangement, he said, with the precision of a man who has learned that the exact boundaries of what he says matter. No. At the time of the arrangement. That's a very careful sentence, she said. I'm a careful man. You're a man who used my father to engineer my circumstances until I had no viable option but to walk into a marriage you'd been designing for over a year. Her voice was level. She needed it to be level because the alternative was something she couldn't afford in this room, with these men, at this hour. And then you sat across a dinner table from me and spoke to me about terms and contracts as though we were two independent parties reaching a mutual agreement. The terms were genuine. The terms were a leash with padding on the collar. Her father moved toward her. Evelyn, don't. She held up a hand and he stopped, and the stopping of him, so immediate, so conditioned, told her something else, something about the power dynamic that existed between her father and this man, about who had been directing this arrangement from the beginning and who had been following instructions dressed up as initiative. Why is he here tonight? She said to Cedric. He received information this afternoon that alarmed him. What information? Her father answered. That Hardcastle knows you've seen the documents, that his people were watching the house. His voice had lost whatever remained of its paternal authority and was operating now on simple fear, which was a more honest register. I didn't know they'd move this fast. When I came to the Duke, the understanding was that you would be kept at a distance from the operational elements until the final stage, that the marriage would provide cover, but that you specifically would be protected, Evelyn said. Yes. By being kept ignorant. By being kept safe. She looked at her father, this man who had bounced her on his knee and taught her card games and told her, repeatedly, throughout her childhood and young womanhood, that she was the sharpest mind in any room she entered. And she felt something she didn't have a word for, which was itself unusual because she generally had words for everything. It was the sensation of a door closing. Not dramatically, not with finality's noise, just the quiet click of a door that had been open her entire life settling into its frame. You told him everything about me, she said. My habits, my methods, the way I read people, the way I write. He needed to know who he was. He needed to know how to construct a situation I couldn't think my way out of. She turned to Cedric. The books in my rooms, the desk angle, the fireplace. Yes, Cedric said, researched from his descriptions. Yes. And the conversation in this carriage, the way you spoke to me, the way you calibrated it. I knew how you responded to directness and how you responded to being underestimated. I used both. He said it without apology, which she had stopped expecting, and without the pretense of regret, which she found she respected more than she wanted to. Everything I told you was true. The terms were real. The contract was genuine. The information I shared about the conspiracy was accurate and complete. I didn't lie to you, Evelyn. You engineered the conditions under which I would arrive at the conclusions you needed me to arrive at. Yes. And you don't see a meaningful distinction between that and lying. I see a distinction, he said. I chose not to prioritize it. The fire. The maps. The two men in this room who had, between them, constructed the last year of her life with the precision of military cartography and the moral flexibility of men who had decided that their objective justified the route. She thought about the notebook behind the loose board. 14 pages. Dates, times, descriptions, analysis. All of it compiled with the focused energy of a woman who believed she was operating independently, gathering intelligence, building leverage. All of it, probably, within the general parameters of what they had expected her to do. The thought was briefly unbearable. Then it wasn't. She let it be what it was, the evidence of a situation she hadn't chosen, and she let it settle. And she looked at what remained after the initial shock finished its work. And what remained was this. The conspiracy was real. The deaths were real. The documents in the folio were real. The men watching the house from the grounds were real. Whatever the architecture of how she'd arrived here, here was the actual place, and the actual place had its own demands. The third name, she said. Her father's face did something complicated. Evelyn? He started. The third name, she said again to Cedric. You said you'd tell me in the morning. Tell me now. Cedric looked at her father, a look that contained a history she hadn't been present for. The 14 months of communication, the negotiation, the full weight of whatever her father had traded away to get himself clear of a conspiracy that had started to consume him. Edward, Cedric said. Not a question, a direction. Her father looked at his daughter. He had the face of a man about to say something he has been postponing for a very long time and has finally run out of road. It's your mother's brother, he said. Not Prescott, the other one, Charles. She heard it. She stood completely still and heard it, and let it move through her and felt the specific, cold, invasive quality of it. The way it reorganized everything, not just the conspiracy, but her childhood, her mother's family, the holiday visits and the letters, and the particular warmth that her Uncle Charles had always shown her specifically, the interest he had taken in her development, the way he had encouraged her to read widely and think carefully and never accept the surface of anything. He had been cultivating her, possibly for years, possibly since she was 17 and her Uncle Prescott had started using her to synthesize political correspondence and someone had noticed and understood what it meant about her capabilities. How long have you known? She said to her father. I suspected for 2 years. I confirmed it 8 months ago. 8 months ago. She breathed in through her nose, slowly, the way you breathe when the alternative is something you can't take back. 8 months ago, you knew that the man who has spent my entire adult life mentoring me was one of 3 people responsible for the deaths of 300 soldiers and the deliberate crippling of my husband, and you said nothing to me. I said nothing to you because Charles doesn't know what I know about his involvement, and if he suspected that you knew, he would. Evelyn, he is not the man you think he is. No one in this room is the person I thought they were. The silence had a texture to it, dense, accumulated. She looked at Cedric. He was watching her with that stripped-back attention, not the monitoring she'd catalogued, not the strategic assessment, but something more direct and less controlled, the face he had when things were moving faster than his management of them. The men on the grounds, she said, are they Charles's men or Hardcastle's? Cedric's expression shifted fractionally. She had surprised him. Hardcastle's, he said, but Charles will know they're here by morning, and Charles will understand what that means. He'll understand that the timeline has compressed and that his 2 co-conspirators are moving without coordinating with him, which will alarm him. He'll want to meet with you. He'll contact me directly. Almost certainly. And when he does, she said, you want me to meet with him? The fire shifted. Her father made a sound that was not quite words. What I want, Cedric said carefully, and what I think is advisable are 2 different things at this particular. Stop managing the sentence. She crossed to the desk, stood directly in front of him with the full, deliberate weight of a woman who has just had the scaffolding of her entire constructed reality removed and is still standing, which is its own kind of information about what she's made of. Do you want me to meet with Charles or not? Cedric looked up at her. For a moment, a genuine, unguarded moment of the kind she'd seen only in fragments before. She saw what 12 years of this looked like from the inside. Not the strategy. Not the network, not the patient, systematic construction of a case against men who believed themselves untouchable. The human cost of it, the price paid in the currency of every connection that might have existed but didn't, every trust deliberately not extended, every version of himself that had been sacrificed on the altar of the objective. The loneliness of it was enormous. She saw it and filed it and did not let it move her. Not yet. There was no room for it yet. Yes, he said, I need you to meet with him. Then here's what's going to happen. She picked up the pen from the desk, pulled a sheet of paper toward her. I'm going to write Charles a letter tonight in my own voice, with no structure you've provided. I'm going to tell him that the marriage has been difficult, and that I've learned things about my husband that concern me and that I need his counsel. She looked at Cedric steadily. He'll believe it because it's mostly true. He'll come to me because he needs to know what I know and whether it's dangerous to him. And when he comes, Cedric said slowly, when he comes, I'll find out exactly what he knows, what he's communicated to Hardcastle, and whether there's a fourth party in this that none of us have identified yet. She picked up the pen, set it down, picked it up again. And then I'll decide what to do with that information based on what I think is right. Not what you've planned, not what my father has traded away. What I think. Her father started to speak. Father. She didn't look at him. Go home. I'll contact you when I have something to tell you, not before. The room held its breath. Edward Ashford looked at his daughter, at this person who was and wasn't the woman he had helped engineer into this house, and something in his face broke quietly, without drama, the way old certainties break when you see clearly for the first time what they actually cost. He left without speaking. Evelyn listened to his footsteps until they were gone. Then she sat at Cedric's desk, in Cedric's study, under the maps of a campaign she had not chosen, and was now irrevocably inside. And she wrote a letter to her Uncle Charles in the particular voice of a woman in distress who needs the counsel of a trusted man. She wrote it with steady hands. She was not the instrument they had designed her to be, and she was not the opponent she had planned to become, and she was not yet whatever she was in the process of turning into, but she was writing the letter. And that she understood as the pen moved across the page and Cedric sat 3 feet away in absolute silence, watching her with an expression she had never seen on him before and could not yet name. That was the moment there was no returning from. Not because of what the letter said, because of who she was choosing to be in the writing of it. Someone who had looked at a room full of men who had used her and decided to use the room back. Not for them, and not despite them, but through a door of her own construction that none of them had known to plan for. Outside, in the pre-dawn dark of the Blackthorn grounds, Hardcastle's men were watching the house. They were watching for the Duke. None of them were watching for her. That, she thought, finishing the last line, signing her name in the particular cursive her Uncle Charles had always praised as elegant. That was the last mistake they would ever make. Charles Ashford arrived on a Tuesday. He came in the afternoon, in the open, in a carriage that bore his family crest with the particular confidence of a man who has decided that visibility is its own form of protection, that the innocent travel in daylight and the guilty travel at 3 a.m. through rear gates, and that as long as he performed the former convincingly enough, the latter would remain invisible. Evelyn received him in the front drawing room. She had chosen the room deliberately, not the east wing, which was hers, not the study, which was Cedric's, but the neutral ground of the formal drawing room with its high windows and its sight lines to the drive and its proximity to the corridor that connected to the east receiving room where, behind a door that appeared closed, Cedric sat with the full folio and 3 men she had not yet been introduced to, but whose presence she had registered over the past 4 days as the manor's internal geometry shifted. More people, moving with more purpose. The controlled tension of an operation entering its final configuration. She had told him, "Let me do this first, alone." He had looked at her for a long moment. Then, "You have 1 hour." Charles kissed her cheek. He smelled the same, cedar and old books, the smell of her childhood's most trusted rooms. And she let herself register that, and then she set it down and did not pick it up again. "You look tired," he said, settling into the chair across from her with the ease of a man accustomed to reading rooms and finding himself comfortable in them. "Marriage is demanding," she said. "I imagine his particular marriage is more demanding than most." He looked around the drawing room with the appraising attention of a man cataloging his environment. "Where is the Duke?" "Resting. He has good days and difficult ones." She poured tea with steady hands. "You didn't come all this way to ask about Cedric's health." Charles accepted the cup, looked at her over the rim with eyes that were, she understood now, had understood since 3 a.m. 4 days ago when her father said his name, always assessing, always calculating, the warmth the surface deployed over the machinery underneath. She had thought it was love, it was investment. Your letter concerned me, he said. It was meant to. What have you learned about your husband that worries you? She set down her own cup, looked at him directly, which was the only way she knew how to look at people she was trying to read through. I've learned that he's been building a case against 3 men for 12 years. Men who conspired to betray his regiment during the Northern Campaign. She watched his face. Men who let 300 soldiers walk into an ambush they could have prevented. Charles was very good. She gave him that. The stillness was almost perfect, the expression calibrated to concern rather than alarm. The micro-movements of a man receiving troubling information rather than a man hearing the specific shape of his own exposure. Almost. That's a serious claim, he said. It's a documented one. Evelyn. He set down his cup, leaned forward with the specific posture of intimate counsel, the posture she had trusted her entire life. Whatever documents your husband has shown you, you need to understand that a man who has spent 12 years in isolation building grievances is not a reliable narrator of, he has your letters, Charles. The stillness became a different quality of stillness. Letters you wrote to Hardcastle, she said, and letters Hardcastle wrote to you, and a financial record of the advancement that was promised and delivered over the subsequent years. She held his gaze. He has everything. The drawing room was very quiet. Charles looked at his niece, this woman he had cultivated with the patience of a man who understood that well-developed instruments were worth the investment of years, and something moved through his face that she had never seen there before. Not the warmth, not the counsel, not the performance, the actual man. How much does he know about my current role, he said. The directness of it, the immediate pivot from denial to damage assessment, was its own kind of answer about what Charles Ashford actually was underneath the architecture of his presentation. Enough, she said. Evelyn. His voice had changed. Lower, stripped of the avuncular register. I need you to understand your position very carefully. Your husband has made enemies of 3 men who have, between them, enough influence to dismantle everything Blackthorn has built, everything your family has recovered, everything you are currently standing on. Are you threatening me? I'm orienting you. He stood. The room felt different with him standing, larger somehow, the threat of him more dimensional. Your husband is going to lose this. Whatever he's planned, whatever he thinks he has, the people he's moving against have survived longer and managed worse threats than a crippled duke with a collection of old letters. And when he loses, everyone connected to him loses with him, including you, including your mother, including your brother, whose commission can be just as easily rescinded as it was reinstated. She stood. She was several inches shorter than him, and it didn't matter. You need to get me those documents, he said quietly. Whatever he's compiled. The full folio. You bring it to me, and I can make sure that when this resolves, your family is on the side that survives. And Cedric? The pause was exactly as long as it needed to be to tell her everything. Some situations, Charles said, resolve in ways that can't be fully controlled. She looked at the man who had read to her when she was 9 and taught her chess when she was 12 and told her, repeatedly, over 23 years, that she was capable of anything, and understood that every word of it had been the cultivation of a resource. Get out of this house, she said. Evelyn, get out now, or I'll have you removed. His expression went through several things in quick succession. Surprise, recalculation, something harder underneath. And then he straightened his jacket with the composed deliberateness of a man who has been in worse rooms than this and survived them, and he walked to the door. He paused in the frame. You're making a decision you don't fully understand the consequences of. I understand them perfectly, she said. I just don't care about the ones you're counting on. He left. She stood in the drawing room until she heard his carriage on the drive, and then she walked to the connecting corridor and opened the door to the east receiving room and looked at Cedric. He's going to Hardcastle tonight, she said. I know. He'll tell him the documents are real and that I've seen them and that I refuse to... I know. Cedric was already moving, not toward the door but to the desk, where the 3 men she didn't know were arranged with the focused energy of people entering the execution phase of a long-planned operation. Evelyn, the Hardcastle dinner is tonight, she stopped. Tonight. You said 2 weeks. I moved it. 3 days ago, when it became clear that Charles's involvement meant the timeline had to compress further. He looked at her. The invitations went out under your name, your signature. You forged my... Mrs. Hartwell has your signature from household correspondence. I needed it done before you knew the full picture. The unflinching quality of his delivery, not apologetic, not defensive, simply factual, was both infuriating and, in the specific clarity of this moment, almost a relief. No more management, just the bare mechanics of what was happening. Every significant member of Harcastle's network received an invitation to a dinner at Blackthorn Manor this evening. They'll come because they want to see what I am. They'll come because they're frightened, and frightened men need intelligence, and this looks like intelligence. They'll come because they believe that between the three of them, they walk into any room and walk out of it in control. She processed this. And when they arrive, the full evidence package, the folio, the March documents, and 3 additional dossiers compiled over the past 2 months will be distributed simultaneously to the Lord Chief Justice, 2 senior members of the Privy Council, and a journalist at the Times whose professional integrity I have verified personally. The distribution happens at 8 o'clock tonight regardless of what occurs in this house. He held her gaze. By the time Harcastle, Prescott, and Charles sit down at that table, their exposure will already be complete. The dinner is not the trap. The dinner is the notification. The scale of it settled over her. You're not going to destroy them tonight, she said slowly. They're already destroyed. Tonight is you telling them so. Tonight is the closing of a 12-year account. And you needed them in this house for that. I needed witnesses. I needed it to occur in a controlled environment. And he stopped. The pause was different from his usual pauses. Not the calculation of a careful man choosing words, but the hesitation of a man encountering something that doesn't have a tactical frame. I needed it to be somewhere I have the advantage. One of the 3 men said quietly, "Sir, we have movement at the north perimeter." The room's energy changed instantly. Not panic, the shift was too disciplined for panic, but the specific, focused compression of people who have prepared for exactly this and are now inside it. How many? Cedric said. 6, possibly 8. They came through the Harcastle estate boundary on the east side. Not here for the dinner, Evelyn said. No, Cedric said. Charles moved faster than I anticipated. She felt it then, the specific cold of a situation that has outrun its planning, the moment when the architecture of a carefully constructed scenario meets the variable that wasn't fully accounted for. Charles had left 20 minutes ago and had either already been in communication with Harcastle or had sent a rider the moment his carriage cleared the gate. 8 men through the north perimeter, not a social call. Mrs. Hartwell, Cedric said, and the housekeeper appeared from the doorway with the readiness of a woman who has been within earshot for exactly this eventuality. Lady Evelyn to the— Don't, Evelyn said. This is not the moment for— I'm not going to the East Wing. She looked at him, at this man, this exhausting, infuriating, architecturally precise man who had built their entire world as a function of strategy and was now, in the moment where all of it was converging, trying to move her to safety the way you move a piece off the board before the real game begins. I'm not a piece, Cedric. We established that. You're my wife. The words landed differently than she expected, not as a tactical claim, not as the contractual designation they had been for 3 weeks, but with a weight that came from somewhere underneath the strategy, from whatever was left of the man after 12 years of this had finished with him. Then stop trying to protect the investment, she said, and let me stand next to you. Something cracked in his face. Not broke, cracked. The hairline fracture of something that had been sealed for a very long time, admitting the first thread of air. 2 minutes, said the man at the window. They're at the garden wall. Cedric looked at Evelyn. She looked back. He said, Stay on my left. She moved to his left. The next 4 minutes happened in a sequence that her memory would later compress and expand unpredictably. The way the mind processes events that are simultaneously too fast and too significant to hold at normal resolution. The first man came through the garden door with the professional efficiency of someone who has done this before and expects it to be straightforward. He encountered instead 2 of Cedric's men who had been positioned since midnight in the structure of the garden itself, invisible in the dark, waiting with the patience of people who had been told exactly when and from where. It was not straightforward. The sound of it reached the receiving room as a series of abbreviated impacts, not the extended chaos of a brawl, but the short, decisive violence of trained men resolving a situation quickly. 3 more came through the east corridor. Cedric moved. This was the moment, this specific moment, that Evelyn would return to later, again and again, with the particular compulsion of the mind that cannot stop examining a thing that permanently rearranged its understanding of something. Because Cedric Blackthorne, in his wheelchair, in the east receiving room of his own house, moved with a speed and economy that did not belong to the man she had been watching for 3 weeks. The wheelchair was not an impediment, it was a platform. His upper body, that contained, compressed, apparently still upper body, deployed with the controlled force of someone who had spent 12 years without the use of his legs, developing everything above the waist into something that operated with the efficiency of a closed system. The first man through the door encountered an obstacle he had not been briefed on and did not survive the encounter with his consciousness intact. The second man hesitated. Hesitation, in this room, with this man, was its own kind of decision. Evelyn had picked up the iron fireplace poker at the first sound of movement in the corridor, not from panic, but from the same operational instinct that had been building for 3 weeks in the specific environment of this house and this man and this situation. And when the third man cleared the doorway and moved towards Cedric's exposed left, she hit him across the forearm with the precise, committed force of someone who is not trying to frighten, but to stop. He stopped. The room went very still. Cedric was breathing hard. The first time she had seen his breath actually visible, the physical cost of what his body had just done breaking through the surface of his control. His knuckles were cut. His jaw was set with the specific rigidity of a man managing pain that has been managed for so long it has become structural. He looked at her. She was still holding the poker. "Good," he said. It was the most unguarded word he had said to her in 3 weeks. From the front of the house, from the entrance hall, from the direction of the main doors through which, in approximately 40 minutes, the formal dinner guests would begin arriving. They heard a sound that was not the sound of Cedric's men resolving a situation. It was the sound of the front doors opening, and then Lord Harcastle's voice, resonant with the confidence of a man who has decided to stop working through intermediaries, carrying from the entrance hall through the corridors of Blackthorne Manor with the absolute assurance of someone who has just bet everything on one move. "Blackthorne, I think it's time we spoke directly." The receiving room was silent. Evelyn looked at Cedric. His face had gone through the crack and out the other side into something she had not seen before. Not the controlled mask, not the brief unguarded moments, but the full, undisguised face of a man who has spent 12 years waiting for a specific moment and is now, with blood on his knuckles and his wife beside him, and the man responsible for everything standing 40 feet away in his entrance hall, finally inside it. He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket, removed a single folded document. "The distribution went out at 7:53, one of his men said quietly from the doorway. 7 minutes ago. Confirmed receipt by all 4 parties. Harcastle didn't know that yet. He was standing in the entrance hall believing he held every card. Cedric looked at the document in his hands, at 12 years of wait, compressed into paper. And then he looked at Evelyn with an expression that she understood, with the clarity of a woman who has spent 3 weeks learning to read a face the world called unreadable. Was not a request for permission. It was something else. It was a man who had operated alone for so long that he had forgotten what it felt like to have someone beside him, and was remembering and was terrified by the remembering, and was doing it anyway. "Together," she said. He moved toward the door, she moved beside him, and from the entrance hall, Lord Harcastle, surrounded by whatever remained of his carefully constructed world, 40 seconds from understanding that it was already gone, waited for the man he had left for dead in a field 12 years ago to come through the door. He had no idea who was coming through with him. Lord Harcastle was a tall man. That was the first thing Evelyn registered as she came through the receiving room door and into the entrance hall beside Cedric. The sheer physical scale of him, which the drawing room gossip and the written record had not conveyed. 60 years old, silver-haired, with the broad-shouldered build of a man who had once been athletic, and had allowed time to thicken without apology. He stood in the center of the Blackthorne entrance hall as though he had arrived to take possession of it, and behind him, slightly to the left, stood her Uncle Prescott, rounder, less certain, with the expression of a man who had been persuaded that this was a good idea and is now revising that assessment in real time. Charles was not with them. She noted that absence the way you note the missing step in a staircase, with the body before the mind catches up. Harcastle's eyes moved to Cedric first, then to her, then back to Cedric with the recalibration of a man who had not been briefed on her presence as a variable. Then, because he was who he was, and had survived as long as he had by recovering faster than his opponents. He settled his expression into something that was almost patrician ease and said, "I didn't realize the Duchess would be joining us. Lady Evelyn is present for everything that occurs in this house," Cedric said. "That is a permanent arrangement." "How modern of you." "Where's Charles Ashford?" Evelyn said. Hardcastle looked at her with the faint, indulgent attention of a man who does not take the question seriously. "Lord Ashford sends his regrets. He found himself otherwise engaged this evening." "He ran," Cedric said. A beat of silence. Hardcastle's composure did not crack. It was too old and too practiced for that, but something behind it shifted, a subtle redistribution of weight, the first sign that the ground under him was not what he had walked in believing it was. "I came here tonight," Hardcastle said, "to offer you an arrangement, Blackthorn, a reasonable one. You're an intelligent man. You understand that certain things that may have occurred during the campaign were decisions made under extreme pressure by people operating with incomplete—" "Your man Whitfield confessed 4 days ago," Cedric said. The entrance hall went very still. Prescott made a sound. Not words. A sound. Involuntary. The kind of noise a structure makes when a load-bearing element fails. "Whitfield has been in my custody since Tuesday," Cedric continued, in the same flat, precise register he used for everything. For dinner conversation, for contract negotiation, for the systematic demolition of a man's life's work in his own entrance hall. He provided a full written account of the meetings, the communications, the financial arrangements, and the specific decision made on the 14th of March 12 years ago. The decision to relay the regiment's position. He paused. "Your handwriting is on the relay order, Hardcastle. Not a letter, not a suggestion. The actual operational order. Whitfield kept it. He's been keeping it for 12 years as insurance, which tells you something about the kind of man you chose to work with." Hardcastle stared at him. For the first time, the patrician ease was simply gone, not replaced by anything dramatic, not by rage or fear in their visible forms, but by the blank, stripped quality of a face that has run out of performance. "The distribution went out at 7:53 tonight," Cedric said. "The Lord Chief Justice has a complete package. 2 members of the Privy Council have a complete package. The Times has a complete package with a request to hold until morning, which I expect will be honored for approximately 4 hours. He looked at Hardcastle with an expression that was not triumph. It was older than triumph, more tired than triumph. The face of a man who has crossed a distance so enormous that arriving at the destination feels less like victory and more like the cessation of an exhaustion so chronic it had become invisible. "It's done. It was done before you walked through my door." Prescott sat down on the entrance hall bench without being invited to, with the sudden vertical collapse of a man whose legs have made a unilateral decision. Hardcastle looked at Cedric for a long moment. Then he said very quietly, "You were supposed to die in that field." "Yes," Cedric said, "I know. 300 men, and you were supposed to be among them. You were the target, Blackthorn, not the regiment. You, your testimony, your records, the campaign accounting you were compiling. You had found the procurement fraud. You were going to bring it to the War Office." Evelyn looked at Cedric. He had known this. The set of his face told her he had known this for years. That the regiment had not been the objective. That 300 men had died as the environmental cost of eliminating one man's inconvenient honesty, and that he had carried that specific knowledge in the architecture of himself for 12 years, like a second injury. And instead, Hardcastle said, with something that was almost grotesquely admiration, "You survived. And you did all of this." He looked around the entrance hall, at the evidence of what Blackthorn Manor actually was, at the Midnight Network and the compiled dossiers and the 12-year patience of a man who had decided to be thorough rather than fast. "I underestimated you." "Most people do," Cedric said. "I find it useful." 2 men appeared from the corridor that connected to the rear of the house. Not Cedric's men, but men Evelyn didn't recognize, until she looked at their bearing and understood they were from the Lord Chief Justice's office, which meant the distribution had been received and acted upon faster than the 8 o'clock timeline had anticipated. They were here for Hardcastle. They were here for Prescott. Hardcastle looked at the men, looked at Cedric, looked briefly at Evelyn, and in that look was something she hadn't expected, which was a kind of recognition. The recognition of one strategist for another, across the wreckage of everything he had built. "Your wife," he said to Cedric, almost conversationally. "Yes." "She wrote the dinner invitations." "She wrote many things tonight. Hardcastle almost smiled. It didn't reach anywhere. I should have accounted for her. Yes, Cedric said. You should have. They took Hardcastle without drama. He walked with them the way men of his generation walked toward the worst moments of their lives. Upright, controlled. The performance of dignity maintained past the point where dignity had any content left to it. Prescott went differently. With the crumpling softness of a man who had never truly believed this night would arrive and was now discovering that belief had not been a shield. Evelyn watched her uncle's back until he was through the door. She had expected to feel something large. What she felt instead was something quiet, the specific quietness of an ending that has taken so long to arrive that its arrival is less explosion than exhalation, the release of held breath, the particular stillness of a room after the people who had filled it with noise are gone. Cedric had not moved. She looked at him. His hands were in his lap. His face was, she searched it, this face she had spent 3 weeks learning to read, empty in a way she hadn't seen before. Not the controlled empty of his management, the actual empty of a man who has been organized around a single purpose for so long that its completion has left him, for the first time in years, with no immediate instruction. She thought about what she'd said to him 2 days ago. You don't know who you are without it, and understood that they were standing inside that sentence now. Cedric, she said. He looked at her. Sit with me, she said. They sat in the entrance hall of Blackthorn Manor, on the bench that Prescott had abandoned, which was perhaps not the most elegant choice of venue for what was clearly going to be a significant conversation, but which was where they were and which, Evelyn had decided, was sufficient. And for a long moment neither of them spoke. The house was very quiet. Outside, the carriage that had taken Hardcastle and Prescott had cleared the gate. The men from the justice's office had gone. The midnight men, the network, the infrastructure of 12 years, had dissolved back into whatever configuration they maintained between operations. Mrs. Hartwell had appeared briefly at the corridor entrance, assessed the situation with the comprehensive efficiency of a woman who had been reading this house's temperature for 14 years and withdrawn without speaking. Just the two of them, in the entrance hall. With 12 years of accomplished destruction between them and the rest of their lives in front of them, which neither of them had, it was becoming clear, spent much time thinking about. Charles will be found, Cedric said. His voice was different, lower, with the roughness of someone talking without managing what comes out. He didn't go far. He's not the type. He'll have gone somewhere he feels protected and waited to see how the night resolved. And when he's found? The package the Times received includes everything on Charles specifically. The journalist is thorough. He'll follow the documentation wherever it leads. A pause. Charles will not be in a position to affect your family after tomorrow morning. Evelyn looked at the front doors. The tall, dark wood of them, the iron fittings, the architecture of an entrance designed to impress and intimidate simultaneously. My mother doesn't know any of this. No, my brother doesn't know. No, she breathed. There are going to be questions from the family, from everyone who knew Charles, who knew Prescott. She was thinking out loud, which she rarely did. It was the specific luxury of a woman who had spent 3 weeks in the proximity of a man who did not require her to perform competence and could therefore occasionally set it down. My father's role, his 14 months with you, that's going to become known. Yes. What did you give him for his cooperation? Immunity from the secondary conspiracy charges he was technically liable for, Cedric said, and the financial arrangement for your family, which was genuine regardless. He gave you Charles. He gave me the confirmation I needed and the access to Charles's correspondence that I couldn't obtain otherwise. Yes, she sat with that. The complexity of her father, not a villain, not a hero, but a frightened man who had found himself inside something too large and had made the most survivable decision available to him and had lived with the shape of it for 14 months. She understood it. She didn't forgive it, not yet, not in the simple, clean way that the word forgiveness implied. But she understood it, and understanding was always the first territory, the necessary ground before anything else could grow. What do you actually know about me? She said. Cedric looked at her. The real answer, she said, not the operational summary. You had 14 months of intelligence from my father and 11 days of watching me work, and 3 weeks of this. What do you actually know? He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then, you're afraid of becoming your mother. She went still. Not her circumstances, he said, her accommodation of them. The way she managed the decline of your family's position with such practiced grace that the grace itself became a kind of complicity. You've been fighting against that accommodation your whole adult life. The sharpness, the unwillingness to pretend. It's not temperament, it's ideology. The entrance hall felt different. The air in it, the specific quality of being seen clearly, without flattery and without malice. Just the bare accuracy of a person who has looked at you long enough and carefully enough to find the true thing, was a quality she had not been in the presence of before. "What else?" she said. "You're lonelier than anyone who knows you would believe, because the intelligence is a wall as much as it's a gift. It's very difficult to be genuinely known by people who feel known by you. People tend to experience competence as a kind of distance." He looked at his hands. "I recognize that. It's a specific kind of loneliness, the kind that comes from being the most aware person in any room you're in." She didn't say anything. "I used it," he said. "I want to be precise about that. I recognized it, and I designed an environment in which it was an asset to me. That was not something I'm going to justify." "No," she agreed. "Don't. But I also—" He stopped. This was new, the stopping in the middle. He was a man who completed sentences because incomplete ones were imprecise. It became something else. At some point in the 11 days before the study, before you found the documents, I was watching you function, and it became something that wasn't operational. She looked at him. "I don't have clean language for it," he said, with the particular frustration of a man for whom imprecision in communication is a professional failing. "I've spent 12 years operating in systems where everything has a function, where every element serves the objective. I don't have a good vocabulary for things that don't." "Things like what?" He looked at her directly. The face beneath the face, fully visible, the way it had been only in fragments before, the exhaustion in it, the years in it, the damage in it. And underneath all of that, the specific, exposed quality of a person who has decided to say a true thing even though true things are the most dangerous things they know. "Things like not wanting you to leave this house," he said. "Not for the arrangement, not for the operation, because the house is different when you're in it, because I sleep differently knowing you're in the East Wing, because watching you hit that man with a fireplace poker tonight was—" A pause. Something moved through his expression that was, remarkably, almost humor. "It was not something I anticipated having feelings about." She laughed. It surprised them both. The actual, unperformed sound of it, in the entrance hall at whatever time it was now, well past midnight, with the wreckage of 12 years of planning settling around them like dust after a demolition. "Cedric," she said when the laugh had finished. "Yes. I need to tell you something." "All right. I came into this marriage planning to dismantle you." She said it with the same flatness he used for difficult truths, the respect of precision. "I was going to learn the house, learn the network, identify your vulnerabilities, and use them. I had a specific plan." "I know. I'm aware that you know. I'm telling you anyway." She looked at the front doors again, and then at the corridor that led to the East Wing, and then at him. "The plan stopped being the plan somewhere around the time I found out that 300 men died because you had the inconvenient integrity to document what you saw. And then it became something else, and I don't have clean language for it either." She looked at his hands, the cut knuckles, the stillness that was resting rather than control now. The hands of a man who had held 12 years of weight and had just set it down. "But I'm not leaving this house. I want to be specific about that. Not because of the contract, and not because of the arrangement, and not because I have nowhere more strategically advantageous to be." "Why then?" he said. "Because you're the most honest person I've met in my life," she said, which is a remarkable thing to say about a man who built an entire deception architecture around our marriage. "But everything you've told me has been true. You just chose the sequence and the timing, and I can work with someone who does that. I can't work with someone who simply lies." He looked at her for a long time. "I'm not an easy man to be near," he said. "I'm not an easy woman. I have habits that are— the 12 years have made me into something that isn't entirely— Cedric." She stopped him. "I'm not asking for the inventory of your damage. I have my own. We can compare them at a later date if you feel it's necessary." The not-quite smile appeared. And then, for the first time in their 3 weeks of marriage, it completed itself, became an actual smile, brief and imperfect, and entirely unperformed, the smile of a man who had forgotten that his face could do that, and was encountering the information with something that was half surprise and half something much more complicated. She reached over and took his hand, not dramatically, not with the weight of significance, or rather, with significance carried lightly, the way you carry things you intend to keep. Her hand over his on the bench, in the empty entrance hall, while London moved through its ordinary night outside the walls of a house that had been a mechanism for 12 years and was now, slowly, becoming something else. He looked at her hand, then he turned his over and held hers. They stayed like that for a while. The house settled around them, its old creaks and adjustments, the specific language of a building that has stood long enough to have opinions about the weather. Somewhere in the back, a clock marked the hour. Mrs. Hartwell would be ensuring the household was settled. The East Wing rooms would be firelit and empty. The study with its maps and its folio would sit in the darkness of its purpose achieved, waiting to be repurposed into something else. "What do you want?" she asked him. Not as a challenge, genuinely. Not the objective, not the arrangement. In the actual life on the other side of tonight. I was quiet for long enough that she counted the seconds again, as she had at the dinner table a lifetime ago. But this silence had a different quality. Not the silence of a careful man choosing strategic words, but the silence of a man who has been asked a question that has no tactical answer and is discovering, somewhere in the unfamiliar territory of his own interior, what the honest one might be. "I want to know what this house sounds like," he said at last, "when it isn't organized around a purpose." She thought about that. "That might take some time to find out." "I have time." A pause. "For the first time in 12 years, I have time." She thought about time, about what it meant to a man who had spent over a decade compressing every available hour into the single project of survival and justice, and who was now standing on the other side of that compression with the strange, open expanse of an ordinary life ahead of him. Most people never understood what they were asking for when they wanted time. Cedric Blackthorne had earned the right to find out. The morning found them eventually, as mornings do. The particular gray light of a London dawn coming through the tall windows of the entrance hall, softening the architecture, making the room look like something painted rather than built. Evelyn had fallen asleep somewhere past 3 with her head against Cedric's shoulder, which was not a comfortable arrangement geometrically, and which neither of them had moved to correct. She woke to the light and to his stillness, and to the sound of Mrs. Hartwell moving quietly in the corridor. She did not move immediately. She lay in the specific warmth of that specific stillness and thought about the woman she had been 3 weeks ago, and the woman she was in this moment, and the distance between them, which was enormous, and which had been crossed not through any single decision, but through the accumulation of 100 small ones, each made under pressure, each revealing something about what she was made of that she hadn't been certain of before. What she had learned in 3 weeks of Blackthorne Manor was not anything that could be reduced to a lesson. It wasn't tidy enough for that. It was more like the knowledge that survives fire. Not intact, not the same, but fundamental in some new way, shaped by the specific heat it has passed through. She had learned that survival and compromise were not the same thing, though the world frequently presented them as such. She had learned that intelligence without direction was just noise, and that direction without intelligence was just movement, and that the rarest thing was the combination of both applied toward something worth applying them toward. She had learned that people who had been damaged in the specific way that Cedric had been damaged, systematically, deliberately, by people they had trusted, didn't heal the way ordinary injuries healed. They became architects. They built structures around the damage so sophisticated and so functional that the world mistook the structure for the person. And she had learned that the most dangerous thing you could do to such a person was not to attack the structure. It was to make them forget, for just long enough, that the structure was necessary. She sat up, looked at him. He was awake. Had been awake, she suspected, for some time, watching the light change the room the way a man watches things when he is trying to memorize them against a future loss he has not yet determined is impossible. "The Times will run it this morning," he said. "Yes. By noon the story will be everywhere. Yes. There will be questions, investigations. My role in the compilation of evidence will become known, which means the network becomes partially visible, which means—" He stopped. She could see him doing it, the automatic pivot back to operational thinking, the reflex of a man whose mind had been structured around the management of consequences for so long that peace felt like a problem waiting to be identified. "Cedric," she said. He looked at her. "It's done," she said. "Let it be done." He looked at her for a long moment. This man, this patient, and terrible and extensively human man, with his cut knuckles and his 12-year exhaustion and his almost smile, and she watched him do something she suspected he had not done in a very long time. He let something go. Not everything. Not all at once. It wasn't a dramatic release. It was the small, specific relaxation of a held thing, the fractional drop of shoulders that have been braced against a weight that no longer exists. The body's quiet acknowledgement that the emergency is over, even when the mind is the last to receive the news. My mother will need to be told about Prescott, Evelyn said, before she reads it. Yes. And my father? I'll have someone ensure he's informed of the outcome this morning. The formal immunity arrangement will be documented before any investigation begins. He'll be protected. She thought about her father, about the particular sadness of a man who had made a survivable decision and survived it, and would spend the rest of his life knowing exactly what survival had cost. That was its own kind of sentence, and it needed no additional ones from her. I want to write to my brother, she said, before he hears from anyone else. There's paper in the study. They moved eventually from the entrance hall, Cedric to the study, where the maps and the empty folio and the exhausted infrastructure of 12 years waited to be dismantled and reassigned, and Evelyn to the writing desk in the east wing, where her notebook sat open to the last entry she'd written in the pre-dawn dark of days ago. She looked at the last line. That was the last mistake they would ever make. She closed the notebook, opened a fresh sheet, wrote to her brother in the honest, unperformed language of a woman who had decided that the energy she'd previously spent on presentation could be better used elsewhere. She told him what had happened. Not everything. Not in one letter, not with the complexity it deserved, but the essential truth of it, that their family was safe, that the people responsible for harm had been held accountable, and that their sister had, in 3 weeks, become something she hadn't been before, and that she was not sorry about it. She wrote for an hour. When she finished, she walked to the study. Cedric was at the desk with the maps. Not the operational maps, but a different one she hadn't seen before, unrolled from some drawer and held flat with the corners weighted by books. It was a map of the English countryside, not annotated with strategic markings, just geography. I was looking at it with the expression of a man considering something for the first time. What are you looking at? She said. There's an estate in Shropshire, he said. My mother's family. It's been empty for 15 years. I've been paying for its maintenance without any specific purpose. And I was thinking about what it looked like in summer. He looked up. There was something new in his face, not the crack, not the flicker, but the full quiet opening of a man who has stopped expecting the next attack and is, tentatively, looking at the landscape beyond it. I haven't been there since before the campaign. Evelyn looked at the map, at the region of Shropshire, with its rivers and its county boundaries and its absolute indifference to the political catastrophes of London. I've never been to Shropshire, she said. It's unremarkable country, he said. Green, quiet, very little of strategic interest. That sounds, she said, like precisely what we need. He looked at her. She looked back. Outside the study windows, London was beginning its morning, the sound of it building gradually from the distance, the city's unceasing, indifferent, magnificent noise. Somewhere in that noise, the morning edition was printing. Somewhere in it, Hardcastle and Prescott were being processed through the machinery of the justice they had spent 12 years avoiding. Somewhere in it, Charles Ashford was sitting in whatever room he had chosen for his waiting and understanding as the news reached him that the waiting was over. And in Blackthorn Manor, in the study with the maps, in the early light of a morning that was the first morning of something, rather than the latest morning of something else, Evelyn Ashford sat beside her husband and looked at the map of Shropshire. She reached over and pointed to a stretch of river valley near the county's western edge. An arbitrary point, no particular reason, just a place her finger landed. What's here? She said. He looked where she was pointing. Fields, mostly. A village. The estate is about 4 miles north of that. Is there fishing? He looked at her. I have no idea. I like fishing, she said. I haven't been in years. My father used to take me. She looked at the map. I'd like to go somewhere there might be fishing. He was quiet for a moment. Then, I'll find out. It was a small thing, the smallest possible thing. An inquiry about fish in a Shropshire river, prompted by a woman's memory of her father. in a time before she knew what her father was capable of, offered to a man who had spent 12 years not finding out anything that didn't serve the mission. It was the first thing he had offered to find out in 12 years for no reason, but that she wanted to know. She looked at him. He was looking at the map, at the river valley near the western edge, with the expression of a man who is learning, in real time, what it feels like to want something ordinary. It looked, she thought, like the beginning of a long education, the kind that required no strategy, no network, no midnight documents or compiled evidence or 12-year patience, just two people in a room with a map, deciding where to go next. She reached over and took his hand again. He held it. Outside, London went on being London, loud, relentless, magnificent, and entirely unaware that in a manner on its edge, something that had been broken for a very long time had just, quietly, in the early light of an ordinary morning, begun the slow and difficult and necessary work of becoming whole.